Story 1. The Room with No Curtains. The road had gone on too long that night. I had been driving through West Virginia, winding through stretches of dark hills, where the only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of a house far off in the trees. My body was heavy with exhaustion, my hands cramped from gripping the wheel too tightly. I needed a place to rest. That's when I saw the motel sign, half lit and buzzing like it was clinging to life. The word motel was spelled out in flickering neon, though the O blinked in and out, leaving it to read more like Mtel. The gravel lot was almost empty, just one old sedan parked near the office. I pulled up close to the front, my headlights washing across a row of doors painted the same faded blue. The place looked like it hadn't been touched since the 70s. The office window was yellowed with cigarette smoke, a buzzing Coke machine sitting just outside the door. Inside, the air smelled like mildew and stale coffee. The clerk sat behind a scratched wooden counter. He didn't even look at me when I came in, just slid a key across the surface. Room 6. His eyes stayed fixed on the desk, and he mumbled something I couldn't make out. I asked if the room had working heat, and he just gave a short nod, like he was trying to get rid of me. I walked across the lot, gravel crunching under my boots. My room was at the far end, the key stuck in the lock, and when I finally got the door open, the first thing I noticed was the window. It stretched nearly the length of the wall and had no curtains, no blinds, nothing. Just bare glass looking out toward the dark stretch of highway. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. I thought about going back to the clerk, asking for a different room, but I was too tired. I told myself I'd just turn off the lights, get under the covers, and face the wall, out of sight, out of mind. The room smelled faintly of old smoke and cleaning supplies. The carpet was stained, the bedspread scratchy, and the bathroom fan rattled when I flipped it on. Still, exhaustion won. I set my bag down, clicked off the light, and lay in the bed. The glow from the motel sign outside cutting pale shapes across the room. It didn't take long before I woke again. Tires on gravel, that unmistakable sound. Crunch, crunch, then silence. My heart jumped. I lay still, staring at the ceiling. Maybe someone else had pulled in. It was late, but people traveled at all hours. I told myself not to be paranoid, but then I heard it again. Sometime later, a car pulling in, stopping. I sat up, looked toward the window, but saw nothing. No lights, no shadows of cars passing by. Just the dim glow of the sign. Its flickering red light spilling into the room. I tried to shake it off, but sleep didn't come easy. My ears stayed tuned to every sound, every creak of the building, every hum of the old refrigerator near the door. Around 2:30, I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly with my chest tight, as if someone had startled me awake. This time it wasn't tires I heard, it was breathing. I lay frozen, my ears straining. The room was silent, except for a faint hiss I couldn't place. I turned my head toward the window, and that's when I saw it. A shape. Someone was standing outside the glass. They weren't moving, weren't shifting, just watching. I couldn't see a face, not clearly, but the outline of shoulders, the slope of a head. It was there, as real as anything. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was a trick of the flickering sign outside. Maybe it was my own reflection, warped by the angle. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The figure didn't move. It was still there, still watching. My hands were shaking as I reached for the lamp, but I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to turn on the light, didn't want to confirm what I thought I saw. Instead, I slid quietly off the bed, crouched low, and grabbed the heavy ashtray from the nightstand. If someone was out there, if they tried to get in, I told myself I'd be ready. Minutes dragged by. The figure didn't move, didn't knock, didn't try the door, just stood there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the sign. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The only thing I could do was wait. At some point, I don't know when, I must have drifted into a half sleep, clutching that ashtray to my chest. When I opened my eyes again, it was 4 a.m. and the window was empty. No figure, no movement, just the faint grey of approaching dawn. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, some kind of trick my tired mind had played on me. I packed up fast, barely brushed my teeth, just wanted to get out. When I handed the key back at the desk, the clerk finally looked at me. His eyes were red, sunken, and for the first time he spoke clearly. "You stayed in 6? He asked. I nodded. He hesitated, then said, "That room's not supposed to have a window." I didn't ask what he meant. I just got in my car and drove until the sun came up, the memory of that figure at the glass following me, as real in daylight as it had been in the dark. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel the weight of its stare, silent and patient, like it was waiting for something. And sometimes, late at night, I wake up certain that someone is standing at my own window, just on the other side of the glass, breathing quietly in the dark. Story 2, The Locked Door, next to mine. The rain had been falling in sheets the entire evening, hammering the roof of my old sedan as I drove along the winding roads near the Tennessee border. The hills loomed dark and silent, cloaked in mist, and the headlights barely cut through the thick fog rolling down the valleys. I'd been on the road longer than I meant to, chasing a delivery schedule that had run late, and my body was screaming for rest. That's when I saw it. A small, run-down motel tucked against the tree line, its neon sign flickering weakly through the rain. I almost passed it, thinking better of stopping somewhere so remote. But fatigue won over, and I turned in. The parking lot was slick with water, reflecting the intermittent glow of the sign. There were only a few cars scattered in front of the rooms, each one older than the next. Paint chipped, tires cracked with age. I stepped out, rain soaking my jacket within seconds, and pushed the glass door to the office open. A bell tinkled, though faintly, like it hadn't been used in decades. The clerk was a woman, hunched over the counter, her dark hair sticking to her damp face. She didn't look up at me, just shuffled some papers, her fingers trembling slightly. Her hands shook enough to make me notice, but I said nothing, forcing a polite smile as she handed me a key. Room 7. As I trudged down the hall, the boards groaning underfoot, I couldn't help noticing the door next to mine. It had a heavy padlock on the outside, thick and rusted. At first, I assumed it was for storage, maybe a closet or an old utility room. It seemed odd for a motel, but the place was full of oddities. The carpet was damp, the paint peeling from the walls, and the smell of mildew was strong enough to make my nose wrinkle. I settled into my room and tried to shake off the unease. The rain pattered relentlessly against the window, a steady drum that seemed to fill the air entirely. I stripped off my wet jacket and boots, tried to focus on sleep. But as the hours dragged on, I began to hear it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, punctuating the darkness like someone trying to get my attention. My heart jumped, and I pressed my ear to the door, half expecting to hear voices. Silence. I told myself it was the rain, the storm rattling the frame in a way that made it sound like knocking, though I couldn't convince myself entirely. Later, around 1 in the morning, it began again. But this time there was more. Whispers, muffled, low and hoarse, like someone gasping words I couldn't quite catch. I froze in bed, straining my ears, but the room was otherwise still. The rain continued its relentless tapping, and yet these whispers seemed separate, deliberate. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a stray animal had gotten inside, a loose board creaking in the wind, or the air ducts carrying some weird sound from the other end of the motel. Every explanation felt hollow, even to me. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The knocks returned sporadically, always 3, then silence. And the whispers, they grew slightly louder each time, just enough for me to feel as though someone was kneeling right outside the wall, speaking just to me. I wanted to leave, wanted to run into the hall and confront whatever it was, but something in me froze. I couldn't move. The air seemed thicker, heavier, and the padlocked door next to mine seemed to loom larger in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Morning came, grey and damp, and I stumbled down to the desk, wet hair plastered to my forehead. The woman looked up for the first time, her eyes wide and unblinking, and froze as I asked about the door next to my room. I told her I had noticed it, how it had a heavy padlock, how I'd heard knocks and whispers during the night. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. She just stared at me, and I realized her hands had gone pale, trembling once more. There's no room there, she said finally, her voice thin and shaky. The motel ends at your room. I blinked, trying to process what she meant. What do you mean? I asked, my voice uneven. There was a door, a padlock. I heard knocking. Her gaze didn't leave mine. No, she repeated, just your room. There's nothing next to it. I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine. I stepped back, shaking slightly, and made my way outside, the gravel slick beneath my shoes. I walked along the row of rooms past mine and stopped at the spot where the door had been. But there was nothing. No metal door, no padlock, no hinge marks on the frame, just a blank wall, weathered and peeling like every other surface, indistinguishable from the rest. I stared at it, heart pounding, rain soaking me, and a terrible realization began to settle in. The door, the knocks, the whispers, all of it had been real enough for me to hear and feel. I had not imagined the terror, the way my skin had crawled when the sound came from right beside me. And yet, in the cold, grey light of morning, the evidence of it had vanished. I never asked for a refund or reported the incident. I didn't know what to say or who would believe me. I left the motel as quickly as I could, the memory of those knocks still echoing in my mind, and I drove until the hills flattened into valleys and the sun burned away the mist. But the memory stayed with me, the sense that something had been next to me, something that had wanted to speak, to reach out, or maybe just to be acknowledged. Even now, years later, I can still picture that padlocked door, and I can still hear the 3 slow knocks, coming at the edge of sleep in the quiet moments of rain. I can't explain it, can't understand it, and part of me doesn't want to. All I know is that night, the motel was more than it appeared, and what I thought was a rundown roadside stop was something else entirely, something that left me uneasy in ways I've never fully shaken. The whispers, the silence, the empty wall, they follow me, faint but persistent, like a warning or maybe just a reminder that some things exist just out of reach of explanation, waiting quietly for the next person to notice. Story 3, the motel with the same guests. I had been on the road for nearly a week, crisscrossing the back roads of rural Kentucky for work. Each night, I'd pull into a cheap roadside motel, places that seemed to have been forgotten by time, with flickering neon signs and paint peeling from the walls. I wasn't picky. Anywhere to lay my head after a long day driving through winding hills and fog-laden valleys. At first, I hadn't noticed anything unusual. The motels were quiet, the few other guests kept to themselves, and I sank gratefully into the thin mattresses, letting the dim glow of the hallway light lull me into sleep. It started subtly on the 3rd night. I had stopped at a place in a small town just off a 2-lane highway, a boxy building with a gravel lot and a flickering fluorescent sign that simply read, Motel. Inside, The air smelled of damp carpet and mildew, the desk clerk's eyes darting nervously as he handed me a key for room 4. I noticed an old man shuffling in the corner of the lobby, leaning heavily on a cane. He didn't say anything, just stared ahead with eyes that seemed too bright and knowing for someone his age. There was also a young couple sitting silently in the chairs by the vending machine. The woman never looked up. The man's gaze flickered around the room as if waiting for something. A woman with long black hair stood by the window, her back turned, watching the rain streak across the asphalt. I didn't think much of it. Motels attract all sorts, I told myself, but something lodged uneasily in my chest, a quiet sense that these faces would haunt the edges of my memory. By the 4th night, the unease had turned into something far more insistent. I pulled into another rundown motel in a town a few counties over. Different name, different lot, same peeling paint, same buzzing neon light. I walked into the lobby and froze. There, in the corner by the vending machine, were the same faces. The old man with the cane, hunched but bright-eyed. The young couple, still silent, still awkwardly sitting shoulder to shoulder. And the woman with her long black hair turned from the room, staring out the same way as before. I shook my head, thinking it impossible. Surely it was coincidence. But the way they sat, the tilt of their heads, even the way their clothing hung on them, it was all identical. I checked in quickly, trying to shake the chill crawling up my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant honk or howl of wind outside made me imagine them in the hallways, lingering just out of sight. By the next morning, my unease had grown so strong I approached the clerk. I asked about the other guests, trying to sound casual, though my voice shook. The clerk looked at me, calm but with an edge of something I couldn't place, and asked slowly, "Are you sure you've been leaving?" I frowned, uncertain what he meant. What do you mean?" I asked. "Those people, they were here last night, in the lobby, same as the night before. The couple, the old man, the woman." He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming the counter. "What room did you stay in?" he asked quietly. I told him, and his eyes flickered, just a fraction, like he was trying to decide whether to say more. "They don't move much," he said finally. "Some of them, they're always here." I wanted to press further, to demand an explanation, but something in the way he said it made me pause. I left the lobby quickly, trying to convince myself it was a trick of exhaustion, a sleep-deprived mind conjuring faces and clothing patterns in the shadows. Yet when I walked past the chairs, the old man with the cane was exactly where I remembered him, the couple exactly as silent, and the woman with her back still turned to the room, hair draped unnaturally long over her shoulders. I checked out and drove on, hoping distance and daylight would erase the unease. But the next 2 nights, the same thing happened, different motels, different towns, but always the same people. Always the same chairs, the same postures, the same quiet, unblinking presence. I tried avoiding the lobby, stayed in my room, shut the door firmly behind me, yet I could feel them outside, lingering, watching even when I dared to glance through the cracked blinds. I started to notice patterns, how the old man's cane scraped the floor in the same rhythm each night, how the couple shifted in unison when someone opened a door, how the woman with the long black hair seemed to always face away, as if guarding something I wasn't supposed to see. I stopped asking for keys near the lobby, stopped trying to strike up small talk, yet the moments of their presence haunted me even in the quiet of my room. It was like they existed just beyond the veil of recognition, slipping in and out of my peripheral vision, always in the same posture, always the same distance apart. By the end of the week, I couldn't tell reality from exhaustion. I found myself imagining them in every empty corner, on every motel couch I passed, following the familiar patterns of the trip in my mind. It was maddening, disorienting. The sense that no matter how far I drove, how many different towns I passed through, they were always there, constant, unchanging. I never confronted another clerk after that fourth night. I drove back to the interstate, avoiding small back roads, avoiding the motel signs that flickered in the fog. But even now, years later, I can see them clearly in my mind. The old man leaning on his cane, the silent couple, the woman with her back turned. I see them in abandoned parking lots, in my rearview mirror when I drive alone late at night, even when I close my eyes. And the strangest, most unsettling thing is that I still have no explanation. I can't say whether they were ghosts, hallucinations, or some strange trick of coincidence, because every detail, the way they sat, the clothes they wore, the corners of those neglected motels, remains vivid in memory. I think about that week often, and a part of me fears the next time I'm on the road, checking into a cheap roadside motel, alone and tired, because I know in some quiet, unassuming lobby somewhere, those same faces are waiting. And I can't tell if they're watching me or if I'm the one who can't stop seeing them. The memory lingers, a dull ache behind my eyes, a sense of inevitability and disquiet I can't shake. They are there, somewhere, repeating themselves, always the same, and I'll never be sure whether I ever truly left those motels, or if I was already trapped among them the whole time. Story 4. The static on the television. I had been driving for hours along a narrow Appalachian road, the kind that bends and twists between the forested hills until headlights barely penetrate the darkness. Rain had started earlier in the evening, soft at first, then turning to a steady drizzle that tapped against the windshield and made the tires hiss over the wet asphalt. I was tired, stiff from hours in the driver's seat, and the thought of a warm bed, even in a cheap roadside motel, was enough to make me pull off the highway. That's when I saw it. A small, forgotten building with a flickering sign, barely legible, promising rooms that may or may not be available. I turned into the gravel lot, the sound of the tires crunching over rocks loud in the still night. Inside, the air smelled like mildew and old cigarettes. The lobby was small, furnished with threadbare chairs and a sticky linoleum floor. The desk clerk didn't look up when I entered, shuffling papers as I asked for a room. He muttered a number, room 5, and slid an old metal key across the counter. His hands trembled slightly, though he didn't seem to notice, and I didn't ask questions. I just wanted out of the rain. The hallway to my room was dimly lit, the carpet worn and damp. I fumbled with the key, finally turning it in the lock, and the door opened with a low creak. Inside, the room was small and stale, the bedspread thin and itchy. On the far wall sat a box television, an old thing with wood paneling and a thick layer of dust, perched on a crooked stand. I dropped my bag on the floor and moved toward the bed, flipping the light switch. The television clicked on with a pop and a flicker, static filling the screen before I had even touched it. I froze for a moment, certain I hadn't turned it on. I yanked the plug from the wall. The screen still buzzed and hummed, white-grey static dancing like tiny snowflakes. I pressed the plug in and out again, unplugged it from the surge strip. Nothing stopped it. The static persisted, and slowly, impossibly, the shapes began to emerge. Faces, hazy at first, appearing through the white noise. Mouths moving as if speaking, though no sound came from the screen. I backed away, my stomach tightening, my hands trembling. The hours dragged on, and the storm outside seemed to grow louder, wind rattling the windows, rain hammering the roof. I tried to focus on sleep, pulled the covers up to my chin, but the faces in the television never left. Sometimes they vanished, leaving only static, but just as often they returned, murmuring silently, eyes too bright, lips moving with no sound. Around midnight, I thought I heard voices, not from the television, but beneath the door. Low, murmured, the same tone as the mouths I had seen. I pressed my ear against the wood, certain I was imagining it, certain it was just the storm or the thin walls. But no, the whispering continued, soft but distinct. I could make out syllables, fragments, something like begging, like words I was meant to understand but couldn't. My heart raced and I forced myself to open the door. The hallway was empty. The faint flicker from the exit sign down the hall revealed nothing. The carpet was wet, the fibers matted down as if someone had been standing there just outside my door, waiting. I stared for what felt like minutes, the sound of rain now muted in my ears, the whispers gone, replaced with a gnawing silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I wanted to run, to slam the door, to wake the clerk and demand an explanation, but my legs felt like lead, my mind frozen. I returned to the room, double-checked the television, still unplugged and still alive with static. The faces were back, moving slowly, shifting from one expression to another, mouths opening and closing without sound. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from them even though every instinct screamed to flee. My chest ached, a tight, crawling sensation that made me feel trapped in the room with them, prisoners of their silent watching. Sleep came in fitful bursts, dreams filled with static, the voices whispering under doors, down hallways, in empty parking lots. I awoke to the same murmur, the same weight pressing at the edges of my consciousness, and for hours I sat on the bed, staring at the screen, hoping it would vanish, hoping that when morning came, the room would be normal again. It wasn't. The faces never fully left, lingering in the corners of the television, shadows in the room, and in the silence, I could still hear their faint whispers, even if no one was there. When I checked out, the clerk didn't ask any questions. I gave him the key, and he barely glanced at me. The rain had stopped, leaving the lot slick and quiet. I drove away slowly, unable to shake the image of those faces, their silent lips moving, their eyes too bright, staring as if following me. Days later, I still see them when I close my eyes, feel them in the corners of my apartment at night, and I know I'll never understand what I saw. Something about that motel, that room, the static. It wasn't just a television, and it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. I left the building, but it didn't leave me. Even now, when I drive alone on back roads, especially at night, I half expect the hum of static to rise up from the dashboard, voices speaking to me again, a warning or a memory I can't place. I tell myself it's impossible, that I imagined it in exhaustion and loneliness, but my fingers tighten on the wheel in the dark, and my stomach knots just thinking about the way the screen moved, the way those mouths opened and closed, the way the whispering sounded so near, yet so unreal. I don't go back to motels in the mountains anymore. I avoid roads that cut deep into the valleys, avoid the kind of abandoned-looking signs that promise a bed for the night. But even in towns, in the safety of daylight, I carry the memory. The quiet, persistent fear that if I ever pull into another forgotten motel on a rainy Appalachian night, the static will return, and those faces will still be there, moving, watching, whispering words I can't understand, and I won't be able to leave. Story 5. The Man Who Knocked. Twice. It was just past midnight when the first knock came. 2 sharp, deliberate raps against my motel door, echoing down the narrow, dimly lit hallway. At first, I thought it was someone at the wrong room, maybe another traveler who had wandered the halls in the storm outside. But when I looked through the peephole, there was nothing. The fluorescent light above the corridor flickered, casting the peeling wallpaper into wavering shadows, and for a moment I questioned if I'd imagined it. The room smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarette smoke, a combination that usually made me uneasy, but tonight it seemed heavier, oppressive in a way I couldn't place. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The wind rattled the windows, and rain pattered against the roof in irregular bursts, but I knew that sound. That knocking was separate, human, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was the motel's old plumbing or the heating system settling, but the silence afterward made my chest tighten. Minutes crawled by like hours. And then it came again. 2 knocks, harder this time, reverberating in the narrow corridor and into my ribcage. My stomach dropped. Someone was there, and they weren't just passing by. I pressed my ear to the door and waited, willing myself to hear nothing, and then the quiet stretched long enough to make me question my own hearing. Heart hammering, I reached for the phone, only to find the line dead. No dial tone, nothing but the muffled rumble of the storm outside. I checked the peephole again. Nothing. The hallway was empty, dim and silent except for the occasional drip of water from the ceiling vent. My instincts told me to call the desk, to demand someone come check the hall, but a strange reluctance held me back. I felt like I'd crossed some line if I drew attention to it, like calling the office would make things worse. Instead, I tried to convince myself to sleep, to ignore it as a trick of nerves and exhaustion. I moved the chair next to the door and wedged it under the handle, a primitive barricade against whatever, or whoever, was out there. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Time passed slowly, almost imperceptibly. I dozed in fits and starts, waking at every creak of the building. Then, around 4 a.m., I was roused by a subtle shift in the air, a faint movement that prickled the hairs on my arms. The chair was no longer under the door handle. I sat up, panic twisting in my gut, and the door was wide open. I froze, trying to understand. Whoever had been knocking hadn't been trying to get in. They'd already been inside, moving silently enough for me not to notice. The thought churned my stomach and made my limbs heavy with a cold, creeping dread. I pulled the chair back in place and leaned against the wall, too, afraid to move toward the door. The hallway was empty, still coated in shadows that seemed to shift as I blinked. Outside, the rain continued in its irregular rhythm, pattering on the roof and against the asphalt. I couldn't hear footsteps, no whisper of fabric or breath, but I just knew, that someone had been there. My mind raced with explanations: a previous guest, an intruder, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. None of it made sense, and yet the fear was real, palpable in the pit of my stomach. Hours later, when dawn finally broke, I left the room to find the desk clerk. His eyes were small and cautious, the lines of worry etched deeply into his face. I asked about previous guests, about any reports of disturbances, about anyone being in or out of my room overnight. He looked at me strangely, then asked, almost casually, if I'd checked the doors before going to bed. I told him about the chair, about the knocks, about the door being wide open. He blinked slowly, then said, "That's impossible. We've only had one guest tonight, and your room's right at the end. Nothing else." I pressed him for answers. Was there another room down the hall? Was it possible someone had come in through a back entrance? He shook his head. "This motel's been here for 30 years. Nothing gets in or out without us knowing." His tone was polite, but guarded, like he was testing me, waiting for me to realize my mistake. But there was no mistake. I had felt it, had experienced it. The terror had been real, and yet, in the light of day, it felt almost trivial, absurd. I drove away that morning, the road slick with rain, the forested hills of Appalachia rising like shadows on either side of the narrow lane. The motel receded behind me, but the memory of the door, open and waiting, stayed. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had come into that room had long since gone. But the image of that doorway, and the certainty of being watched has followed me in the weeks since, in every hotel hallway, every unfamiliar creaking floorboard, every night when the wind whistles just right through the cracks in my window. Some nights, when the house is quiet and the storm is far away, I swear I can hear it again. The 2 knocks, deliberate and exact, just outside my bedroom door. And though I'm awake and safe, I feel that same cold weight in my stomach, the same creeping awareness that whoever or whatever was capable of such silent entry didn't leave because it was finished. It left because it wanted me to know. And if it wanted me to know, it can come back anytime. I've never returned to that part of the Appalachians, and I never plan to. I don't tell this story much, not even to friends, because it feels impossible to explain, unbelievable even. But I can't shake the certainty that the motel, the knocks, the open door, none of it was random. There's a patience in that presence, a methodical awareness of fear, and I can still feel it lingering in the corners of every unfamiliar room I stay in. I don't know why it chose me, or if it chooses anyone at all, but I've learned to be wary. The door may be closed now, the chair under the handle, but the memory of it will never leave. And that is enough to keep me awake at night, listening for the 2 sharp knocks that may never come again, or may come at any moment. By the time the sun rises fully, spilling light over the hills and wet asphalt, the fear does not lift. It doesn't fade. It waits, patient and persistent, reminding me that some things in the mountains are not bound by locks or walls, and some presences once felt never truly depart. I carry that night with me now, in the rhythm of quiet hallways, in the shadows that linger a moment too long. I cannot explain it, cannot rationalize it, and in truth, I don't want to, because the moment I stop believing in the possibility of that knock, it will return, and I will be ready in some way to hear it again. Story 6. The Room That Smelled of Smoke. I remember pulling off the narrow, winding mountain road just as dusk began to smother the last hints of sun behind the ridges. The sign for the motel was faded almost to illegibility, the letters half peeling from the metal board, swinging in the wind with a hollow clang. I'd been driving all day, trying to make it to a town with more than a single gas station, but I was tired, my throat dry from the dust and the endless Appalachian curves, and the road ahead was dark and uninviting. The place looked empty when I pulled up, one of those motels stuck in a decade no one wants to remember, the kind where the asphalt is cracked and weeds claw at every corner. The lights in the office flickered weakly like they were barely awake, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. The clerk, an older man with a thin face and a mustache that seemed to tremble with each word he spoke, barely looked up as I asked for a room. He gave me a key with a rusted brass fob and muttered something about the last 2 nights being quiet. I nodded, feeling relief at finally having a place to stop, and lugged my bag down the long, dimly lit corridor. My room door opened with a groan, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Cigarette smoke, thick and acrid, so strong it clawed at my throat and made my eyes water. I coughed, waved my hand in front of my face, and looked around. The clerk had assured me the room was non-smoking, and I didn't think much of it, probably a careless previous guest. I tried to settle in, tossing my bag onto the bed and flipping on the light. The room was tired, worn carpet with dark stains, a cracked lamp with a bare bulb, peeling wallpaper that had yellowed from years of neglect, but it was a roof and 4 walls. I went to the window, hoping the mountain air might cut through the staleness. The valley below was swathed in the evening fog, curling around the trees like a living thing, and the last hints of orange sunlight made the peaks glow faintly before surrendering to night. I thought about taking a shower, but the smell of smoke had seeped into everything. It lingered in the fabric of the chair, the sheets, even the bathroom tiles, and it made my chest tighten. I tried to ignore it, hoping sleep would come quickly, but around midnight I woke coughing, the smoke thick thick and choking in my lungs, the room somehow heavier, suffocating. My eyes burned as I staggered toward the door, thinking maybe the air had settled in one corner, or maybe the vent was blowing it around. That's when I noticed it. Thin curls of smoke snaking up from the bathroom vent, pale in the glow of the hallway light, curling like fingers. There was no fire, no flicker of flames, nothing that made sense. Just that acrid scent and the rising smoke. My stomach knotted, a cold weight settling over my chest. I tried calling the clerk from the phone, but the line was dead, only a low static buzzing in my ear. I forced the bathroom door open, heart hammering, and found nothing. The tile floor was clean, the sink empty, no signs of a flame, no smoldering anything. I stepped in closer, drawn by the smell, and the vent seemed to breathe smoke up at me, almost like it had its own life. The metal grill rattled softly, a whispering sound underneath the hiss of my own breath. Panic started to crawl up my spine. I wanted to leave, to slam the door and run down the hall to the lobby, but something made me stop. An instinct I couldn't name. I felt watched, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down from the corners of the room. And then I saw it. My reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't match me. The face staring back had smudges along the jawline, dark streaks that might have been ash, and the eyes were hollowed, sunken in a way that made my stomach churn. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bath mat, and the smoke seemed to thicken around me, rising faster, curling into shapes that were almost human but never quite. I couldn't breathe properly, my throat raw, my vision blurring, and the air seemed to vibrate with a soft, distant cracking sound, like a fire burning somewhere just out of sight. I backed out of the bathroom and slammed the door, my hands shaking. For hours I sat on the bed, coughing, trying to convince myself it was old smoke, years of neglect, maybe even a trick of the light, and my mind running wild. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the smell deepened, curling into my nose, bringing with it that same ghost of heat and ash, and when I blinked, I thought I saw the vent breathing smoke toward me like lungs. The night dragged, slow and cruel. The air seemed to thrum with the memory of fire, of heat and panic, of something trapped just beyond the walls I had foolishly thought were safe. Morning didn't bring relief, only light that made the room look worse than it had in the dim glow of evening. I checked the bathroom again, still the same, still nothing. But the smell lingered. I went down to the office, still coughing, and tried to explain what had happened. The clerk didn't flinch, didn't blink, just tilted his head and looked at me with those thin, tired eyes. He nodded slowly, almost knowingly, and said, "That room. Yeah, there was a fire there, years back. Been sealed off since." His words sank into me like stones. I asked why it was open, why I'd been given that key, and he shrugged, as if that was a question that didn't need an answer. I left the motel as soon as I could, the road stretching ahead in twists and turns, the mountains rising dark and silent around me. But I couldn't shake it. The smoke, the vent, the sense that something lingering there had watched me, had let me breathe for a moment, and then remembered itself. I thought about returning, about asking for the room to be shown to me. But a part of me knew some things weren't meant to be disturbed, weren't meant to be understood. Even now, months later, I can catch a faint trace of that smell when the wind shifts just right, and I remember the way the smoke rose, slow and deliberate, curling like it had secrets to tell, secrets I was never meant to hear. I don't know if the motel had ever truly closed that room off, or if it was always there, waiting, a remnant of a fire that never fully died, a scent that remembered panic and ash and fear. What I do know is that the mountains are full of places like that, places where time folds and memory lingers in the walls like smoke, stubborn and invasive. I've never stopped thinking about it, and sometimes, when the wind is right and I drive past the forests of Appalachia, I swear I can smell that room again, thick and bitter. And I remember how close I felt to something that could have been waiting centuries to breathe me in. The smoke never leaves, and somehow, neither does the memory. Story 7. The motel with no other cars. I had been driving for hours along the Appalachian stretch of Highway 19, the sun long since swallowed by dense mountain shadows, and my eyes were beginning to burn from the endless glare of the asphalt. I hadn't passed a soul in over an hour, just the occasional curve of trees pressed close enough to block any view of the valley below. My mind kept wandering to the day's work, the worries of bills and deadlines, but every few minutes I found myself scanning the dark roadside for a place to stop, anything that looked like warmth or light. That's when I saw the sign, a hand-painted motel swinging on rusty chains, the letters half peeling, neon flickering weakly. I slowed, pulled into the lot, and found it completely empty except for my own old truck. The gravel crunched beneath my tires in the silence, and the wind through the pines carried a sharp, almost sour smell. I stepped inside, greeted by the dim glow of a single ceiling bulb above the front desk. The clerk was a thin man, gaunt in a way that made the shadows of his cheekbones seem like hollows, wearing a stained shirt and a tired expression. He smiled, but there was something too slow, too deliberate in it. "Evening. Plenty of rooms. Take your pick," he said, his voice raspy, like he'd been speaking through a cough for decades. I handed over my card, and he gave me a key with the number scrawled on it in a shaky hand. As I walked down the narrow corridor to my room, the air inside smelled faintly of mildew and old varnish, a scent that made the hairs on my neck prickle. I shut the door behind me and leaned my back against it, letting the quiet settle. It was too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you, fills your ears until you start noticing the small things. The hum of the fridge in the corner, the ticking of the old wall clock, the soft creak of the floorboards under my own weight. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, setting out my bag and water bottle, but it was impossible to ignore the sound above me. A door somewhere on the floor above opened with a slow, deliberate creak, then shut, followed by footsteps pacing softly, the kind that seem muffled through layers of thick carpet. I froze, telling myself it was probably someone else in the motel, but every glance out my peephole into the empty lot reminded me of the truck, mine, the only one there. As night deepened, the sounds grew sharper, more distinct. A voice, muffled but rising into a frustrated argument, drifted down from somewhere overhead. I pressed my ear against the wall, heart hammering. I couldn't make out the words, just the cadence of anger, the scrape of shoes against wood. Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching into a kind of tense watchfulness I hadn't felt since I was a kid hiding under the bed during storms. I told myself the place was old, thin-walled, and that maybe the next room had been empty the whole time. But I couldn't shake the dread crawling up my spine. I stepped outside to the small balcony, hoping to glimpse some sign of other travelers, maybe a light flickering behind a curtained window. The lot was still empty. No vehicles had appeared, no headlights, no taillights, nothing. Only the darkness pressed tight against the edges of the motel like a living thing. I went back inside, doors locked, windows shut, telling myself to ignore it. But the feeling followed me. The sounds above my head didn't stop. Footsteps moving from one end of the hallway to the other, doors opening, then slamming shut. Every so often, the muffled voice would rise again, a heated dispute that didn't make sense, as if people were living, arguing, existing in rooms that weren't really there. I didn't sleep. The hallway lamp flickered overhead, and every shadow seemed to stretch too long, reaching for me with patience. At one point, I thought I heard the scratch of furniture being dragged above, a bed shifting, a chair scraping. My mind started playing tricks. I imagined shapes moving just beyond the frame of my vision, hearing the whispered tones of words I couldn't understand. I wanted to check the rooms, see if anyone was there, but every instinct told me that whatever I would find could never be explained and might not be safe to confront. Morning came with an uneasy grey light, and I decided to leave, the drive pulling me like a magnet from a place that had begun to feel alive in a way that was profoundly wrong. I walked back down the corridor, key in hand, my ears straining for any sign of life. Every door was wide open. Each room looked as though no one had touched it in years. Beds were made with sheets untouched, dust motes dancing in the slanting sunlight from windows I hadn't noticed the night before. Not a single footprint, not a coffee cup, not a trace of the voices I had heard. My stomach churned as I glanced around the empty lot. No vehicles, not one other person had ever been there. The air had changed, lighter somehow, but the scent of old varnish and mildew lingered in the hall, clinging to the corners like it had been waiting for me. I realized I'd spent hours listening to people who weren't there, sounds conjured by memory or by the building itself, and yet something about the way the doors had been left open felt deliberate, almost like the place had been aware of me all along, letting me witness its mimicry before I left. I tried to rationalize it, saying it must have been an old motel trick, warped floorboards and the wind through the mountains, but a part of me knew that whatever I'd heard, the pacing and the arguments, the opening and shutting of doors had never been normal. Driving away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see shadows moving in the windows of the motel, or a figure lingering on the balcony watching me go. The gravel lot behind me stretched empty, like a memory someone might have of a place that existed once and then vanished. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as the road curved into the mountains again, the trees closing in on either side. I thought about looking back, about stopping to see if maybe I'd misjudged it, if the motel was just a relic of neglect and the mountain wind had done all the work. But some part of me resisted, knowing that looking back would mean opening a door I wasn't ready to enter. Even now, years later, I think about that night whenever I drive along forgotten roads, about how the walls seemed to breathe and how the footsteps moved without anyone there. I tell myself it was exhaustion, the tension of isolation in the mountains making my imagination run wild. But the certainty I felt, the sensation that I had been watched by rooms that shouldn't have been alive, still clings to me. I can't explain it, and no one I've ever told believes me. I can remember the argument overhead as clearly as my own heartbeat, the faint scrape of chairs, the sigh of doors opening and shutting. It stays with me, that hollow echo of a place where no one ever was, except, somehow, me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that same sound in my own house, the creak of a floorboard above, the whisper of words I cannot understand, and I wonder if, when I look in the mirror, the empty lot and the doors ajar are still watching me from somewhere in the mountains, waiting for the next lonely traveler to pull off the highway, to park alone, and listen. The fear is quiet, but persistent, a reminder that some places are patient enough to live in memory, long after the roads have moved on and the mountains have swallowed their secrets. Story 8. The Caller from the Front Desk. I remember pulling into that Virginia stretch late, just after midnight, the road narrow and slick from an evening rain that left the air smelling sharp and wet. I was tired in a way that made my bones ache, the kind of weariness you can't shake with coffee or music. The motel sign flickered weakly over the road, buzzing with an unstable rhythm, a pale promise of warmth and sleep. I didn't care how run down it looked. I needed a room. The lot was empty except for my car, a little rusted truck I'd inherited from my father, and I remember thinking how odd it was for a place this large to have no other vehicles. Inside, the clerk gave me a polite nod, almost rehearsed. Eyes too bright, too focused, as if he was memorizing my every movement. I asked about a room for the night, and he handed me the key with a casual comment about my payment needing confirmation, but I didn't think much of it. I was too tired, too relieved to sleep, to notice that the fluorescent lights above the desk buzzed at a pitch just slightly off, a tone that pricked the back of my skull. The room smelled of stale carpet and something faintly metallic, like old pennies left out in a damp basement. I set my bag down and tried to ignore it, tried to shrug off the feeling that I was being watched, even though no one else was in the building, or so I thought. Around 2 a.m, the phone rang. The sharp tone cut through the thick silence of the room, and I picked it up on instinct, my fingers trembling more from exhaustion than fear. "Hello?" I said. The voice on the other end was smooth, polite, but something in it made my stomach clench. It said it was the front desk clerk and that there had been a mistake with my payment. It urged me to come down, calmly insisting it would take only a moment. There was nothing overtly threatening in the tone, but it didn't sound human either. Not fully. Too flat, too rehearsed, like a tape on loop. My gut screamed at me to hang up. I did, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself I'd sort it out in the morning. After that, the room felt different. The silence thickened, the shadows in the corners stretching just a little farther, pooling against the walls. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but then I heard the footsteps in the hall. Slow, deliberate pacing right outside my door. My heart skipped when I realized they weren't moving down the hall, weren't fading, weren't going anywhere. Every few minutes, there was a shift, a faint scrape against the carpet, a pause like someone was listening. I didn't hear a knock, didn't hear a voice, just the methodical rhythm of someone who knew I was in there, waiting, studying, savoring the silence. I considered calling the police, but stopped myself. The reception of the cell service in the mountains was weak, shaky at best, and I felt absurdly exposed, alone in the dark, in a motel that seemed to breathe. Around me, the air thick with unease. I checked the peephole several times. The hallway stretched empty each time. I even cracked the door just slightly, peering into the dim yellow light that flickered down the hall, and still, nothing. Not a soul, no movement. I could hear the faint hum of the vending machine down by the lobby, the kind of hum that makes the floor feel alive, but the footsteps stayed frozen outside my door. Hours crawled by like that. The clock on the nightstand ticked slowly, dragging minutes into hours. I could hear faint shuffles, quiet whispers maybe, like someone talking to themselves, or maybe to me. It's impossible to remember exactly what was said. My brain tried to fill the gaps, and I swear I heard phrases that didn't make sense, scraps of sentences floating through the shadows, begging to be understood but refusing any clarity. Sleep was impossible. Every time my eyes drifted shut, I swore I felt the door handle turn, barely, just enough to make my heart leap into my throat. Eventually, the sun's first light bled weakly through the blinds, staining the carpet in pale gold. My muscles ached from tension, from sitting stiffly in the chair closest to the door. I gathered courage and walked slowly to the lobby, trying to keep my movements casual, though every instinct screamed for me to flee. The clerk was behind the desk, the same rehearsed smile in place, and I asked him about the call. He shook his head flatly and said he hadn't called anyone all night. Not a single call. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was a prank, a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I walked back to my truck, staring at the long row of rooms behind me, all silent. Nothing stirred, no evidence of guests, no sign of anyone sleeping, eating, arguing in the shadows. I remember the sinking feeling when I looked back at my room. The door was closed, but it didn't feel right, like it had been closed around something I wasn't meant to see, something I wasn't meant to know. The sun hit the windows unevenly, and shadows curled unnaturally along the walls. I didn't stop to look. I started the truck, the engine loud in the quiet morning, and drove off as fast as I could without wrecking on the narrow mountain curves. Later, I would tell myself it had been stress, the mountain isolation, the long drive, but I haven't been able to shake the sound of those footsteps, pacing for hours, waiting just outside the door. I think about the voice too, flat, rehearsed, not human enough, and I shiver every time. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine it still waits there, outside rooms like that, where no one else is, and maybe it's always been waiting. I never went back, and I don't think I'll ever drive down that highway again. Some places in the mountains hold on to the living, or maybe they just play at it, letting shadows stretch and patience run thin until you feel you're part of the building, part of the quiet that never sleeps. That motel was one of those places. And though I tell people it was probably nothing, I know better. I know those footsteps, the call, the door waiting to be opened, are the kind of thing that doesn't leave. Not really. Even now, sometimes I dream I'm back in that room, phone ringing at 2 a.m, and I freeze, waiting, listening for the careful, steady tread just outside my door. The silence is alive in a way that makes the skin crawl, and I wake up sweating, convinced I hear it again. The truth is, I don't know if I ever left that motel at all, or if the mountains just don't let you go once you've felt how thin the world can be, how a voice and a shadow can stretch hours into eternity. I don't think I'll ever find another room so empty, so quiet, and so filled with something watching. And some nights, I almost wish I hadn't. Story 9. The motel mirror facing the bed. I pulled into the gravel lot of the Roadside Motel somewhere off Route 58, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 70s. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the faded siding and the chipped asphalt, and I remember thinking that the place seemed almost too still, like it had been waiting for someone to arrive. I didn't notice any other cars in the lot at first, which struck me as odd, but the neon sign buzzed weakly and the front door rattled as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and floor polish, with an undercurrent of something else I couldn't place. The clerk behind the counter was an older man, face pale and lined, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He assured me the motel was full tonight, though I could see at least a dozen empty doors from the lobby. I shrugged it off, too tired to question it, and took the key to room 12. The room was small, the kind you'd expect in a mountain motel. A thin mattress on a metal frame, a cheap lamp, and a dresser with one drawer that stuck when I tried to open it. But it was the mirror that caught my eye immediately. A tall, full-length thing mounted directly across from the bed. It had a simple wooden frame, nothing fancy, and yet it gave the room a kind of cold presence, reflecting everything back with a clarity that felt sharper than it should have. I unpacked my bag and lay down, trying to ignore the way my own reflection seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. By the time I turned off the lamp, the last light from the hallway slanting through the window was faint, just enough to make the glass gleam like it was polished for some purpose other than seeing myself. I thought I might drift off quickly, exhausted from the drive, but sleep came unevenly. Every time my eyes closed, I felt them snap open again, pulled back to that mirror. At first it was subtle, a shadow shifting where nothing should be. The corner of the frame caught a movement that didn't match my own. I told myself it was a trick of the low light, maybe my imagination playing after too many hours on the road. But then it grew more persistent. Around 11:30, I noticed it. A figure pacing slowly in the reflection, hands clasped behind its back, shoulders hunched slightly. My heart hammered, but I kept telling myself it was some trick of the light. I got up and walked the length of the room. Nothing was there. Only the mirror showed it moving. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself to close my eyes. That's when I first saw it clearly. My reflection wasn't me, not exactly. It lay in the bed where I had just been, eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at me. My own body mirrored the position I was in, but the eyes were wrong. They held something empty, too sharp, as if the glass had borrowed a part of me I didn't recognize. My stomach sank, and I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure lifted a hand slowly, deliberately, and the glass fogged as if someone had breathed on it, though there was no one else in the room, no heat to condense into mist. The cold dread clamped down around my chest, and I felt trapped in a space that should have been familiar, safe. I spent hours frozen on that edge between wakefulness and panic, the reflection always there, always watching. Every time I moved, it followed. Every time I turned my back, it stayed. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that it was a side effect of isolation, fatigue, the monotony of hours spent driving through the mountains. I forced myself to laugh quietly, shaking my head at the absurdity of it, but the reflection didn't blink. It didn't breathe, it simply existed, patient, waiting, almost as if it had been there long before I had arrived. I remember the way the shadows seemed to lean toward it, the way the small lamplight seemed to flare and dim at random, never in sync with the switch. By the early morning hours, I had stopped trying to ignore it. I couldn't look away. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands gripping the sheet, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the old building settling. And then the fog came again, slowly at first, curling from the edges of the mirror, spreading across the surface as if the glass itself were breathing. My reflection's mouth moved, but no sound came out. I could see my own lips moving in answer, but my throat was tight, my voice trapped somewhere I couldn't reach. I tried to stand, to rip myself from the bed, and the reflection did the same. And yet, as soon as I reached for the frame, it was gone. The mirror was just there, empty, clean, unremarkable. I stayed frozen for a long time, listening to the residual silence that felt louder than any noise I had ever heard. When daylight finally bled weakly through the curtains, I made myself check the room thoroughly. The mirror had vanished entirely. Where it had been, the wallpaper showed a faint, rectangular outline, like a bruise pressed against the wall. I went through the drawers under the bed, even behind the dresser. Nothing. The air felt lighter somehow, but not safe. There was a residue in the room, a weight that hadn't been there before, a sense that I had shared the space with something that had waited for me, quietly, patiently, like it had been expected. I left that motel without asking for my money back, without speaking to the clerk beyond the barest of pleasantries. I didn't want to draw attention to what had happened. I didn't want anyone to know, and I certainly didn't want anyone to look at that mirror and see what I had seen. Driving away, I couldn't shake the memory of those wide, unblinking eyes, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch the same reflection staring back at me from the road. Behind even now, weeks later, I still dream about it. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, staring at the corner of my bedroom where a mirror could be, afraid that it might show me something I'm not ready to face. And though I try to reason it away, I can't forget how certain it had seemed that my reflection wasn't mine, that it had a life of its own, patient and watchful, waiting for the moment I would finally see it clearly. I've never gone back to that stretch of highway, and I don't think I'll ever stay in another roadside motel alone. I still avoid mirrors when I'm tired, when the room is dim, when the world outside feels heavy and silent, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the light catches a glass surface at the right angle, I think I see those eyes again, wide, unblinking, staring, reminding me that even when a room seems empty, it might not be, and that the reflections we trust can carry shadows we are never meant to meet. Story 10. The motel on the wrong road. I remember driving through the hills of Virginia that night. The kind of late summer evening where the humidity clings to your skin and the forest seems to hold its breath. I was on my way back from a work trip, tired, and mostly just following the GPS without paying much attention to the roads themselves. When it told me to turn onto that narrow side road, I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Something about the thick trees pressing in on either side, but I followed it anyway. That's when I saw the motel. Or maybe saw isn't the right word. It was more like I stumbled upon it as if it had been waiting for me. The building was small, weathered, with peeling paint and neon letters that buzzed weakly in the darkness. The parking lot was empty, except for my truck, and a faint smell of damp wood and stale cigarette smoke drifted across the asphalt. Pulling up, I noticed the sign above the office door had letters that flickered inconsistently. M-O-T-E-L, but one of the letters didn't even light. It made the whole place feel unstable, like the sign itself wasn't quite sure it existed. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the smell inside was worse. A combination of mildew, old carpet, and something I couldn't place. Something metallic. Behind the desk sat a man, or something like a man. He was thin, too thin, with pallid skin stretched tight across sharp cheekbones. His eyes were dark and unblinking, and when he spoke, it was in a flat, rehearsed tone. "Room?" he asked. I nodded, and he handed me a key. There was no number on it, just a worn metal fob with scratches I could almost read as random letters. I didn't question it too much at first. I was tired, and the thought of sleeping in my truck didn't appeal to me. The room itself was ordinary in one sense. 2 beds, a small dresser, a TV, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that the place wasn't quite aligned with reality. The walls were thin, and the hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud. I unpacked, tried to shower, tried to push away the feeling that something was wrong. I kept catching movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow that shouldn't be there, a flicker in the hallway outside my door. By the time I lay down, the sensation had grown heavy. Around 11, I thought I heard the front door slam. I ignored it at first, assuming it was the wind or an old building settling. Then I heard footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, stopping just outside my room. I could hear a faint shuffling, like someone pacing, and every now and then a soft mutter, almost a conversation with no other voice. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was staying here. Maybe the thin walls carried every sound. But every time I looked out the window, my truck was still alone in the lot, a single light reflecting off the cracked asphalt. Hours passed like this. The footsteps never left. Sometimes they would recede down the hall and return. Sometimes I thought I saw a shadow pass under the door when I wasn't looking. I stayed under the covers, convinced I was imagining it, trying to breathe quietly so as not to provoke whatever waited outside my door. Around 3, the footsteps stopped for a while. The silence was thick, and I found myself listening to my own heartbeat, loud and irregular in the stillness. Then, without warning, there was a soft knock, or maybe just a thump, and then nothing. I froze, listening, straining to hear any sign that the figure outside my door had moved on. It never did. I don't know how I slept, but when morning came, light streaming through the thin curtains, I felt drained, hollowed out in some way. The room was quiet, the shadows gone, but the air still felt heavy. I decided to check out quickly, relieved to leave. Down in the office, the clerk looked up, same flat expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders. I asked him about the other guests, about the sounds in the night. He blinked slowly and said, "Other guests? Nobody stayed here all night." I froze. "All night?" "All night," he repeated, eyes narrowing slightly. "The rooms have been empty for months." Just you. I must have looked like I'd lost my mind because he sighed and handed me a receipt. "Check your pocket," he said softly. I did, and the key was still there, worn and cold in my hand. I remember looking out the window at the lot, expecting to see my truck alone, maybe a few other vehicles creeping into view. But no, the lot was empty, as though the motel itself had been suspended in some other layer of the world apart from reality. I got into my truck and drove off, the GPS back on, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. Hours later, back on the highway, I thought I could see the outline of the motel in the distance, glimpsed through the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. The road stretched empty, normal, and I couldn't find that side road again no matter how I tried. Every time I drive through Virginia now, I avoid that stretch, and yet I can't shake the memory. The pallid Clark, the footsteps that never moved on, the feeling of being watched in a place that technically shouldn't exist. Sometimes at night, I'll check my pocket, half expecting the key to have disappeared, half expecting it to have turned into something else entirely. It's always there, cold and smooth. And when I'm alone, lying in a motel room somewhere else, I swear I can hear footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, waiting, and I can't tell if they are echoes of that night, or if I somehow brought that motel with me. I don't know what's real anymore. All I know is that some places, some roads, they don't want you to leave, and some things, some people, or whatever they are, don't stop waiting, no matter how far you drive. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the reflection of that empty lot through the windshield, the faint hum of the neon letters buzzing inconsistently, and I feel the pressure of unseen eyes on the back of my neck. The motel wasn't a place you could visit or return to. It was a pause, a wrinkle in the world, a moment when reality frayed, and I can't explain why I was allowed to leave at all. The key in my pocket is the only evidence I have that it wasn't all a dream. It weighs heavy, a constant reminder that some roads lead to places you shouldn't, and some nights, even miles away, those places are still waiting for you.